Hello, join us today to learn more about local food and local fun and managing risk in agritourism activities, where we'll hear a little bit about some of the trends taking place in agritourism and how you can manage some of those risks that go along with those activities. Hello and welcome to Marketing Matters. I'm Christy Welch, Direct Marketing Specialist with our Food and Agricultural Marketing team within OSU Extension. Today we're going to hear part one of a two-part webinar entitled Food and Fun on the Farm, Reducing Liability Risk with Agritourism. You'll hear from two individuals within OSU Extension that'll talk about current trends in agritourism, managing risks that are associated with those activities, and whether or not these might be a fit for your farm. So stay tuned.
Hello everyone, here we roll. We're going to talk about the overall trends and then some of the things that we see happening more and more that you probably are getting questions about already or will start to get more questions about. The first is this overall trend of agritourism 365 is what I'm calling it. If you are from the Midwest, you had so much rain this year, everybody's complaining about we can't depend on just fall seasons in the agritourism industry and maybe a few weddings out of season or events. This is Mays Valley. He started with corn and soybean farm and moved on to add a winery and now a brewery and lots of activities, and now has an adult Easter egg hunt. So definitely year round. It's much more than just fall. It's events and activities outside of spring or a summer season. More than revenue, it's this customer awareness that they can come and do things year round. And it definitely spreads fixed costs and financial risks. So you look at this big barn, for example, that Bill has built. He's now able to use this 11 or 12 months out of the year. And also the big thing is for these farms to keep their best staff. When you just are seasonal, it's really employees are becoming more and more difficult all the time. The second part of the overall trend is authenticity. So we're seeing, are you a real farm or are you just buying and selling things? So because of the local foods movement, this question is being asked more and more at agritourism farms. The other major trends that we'll go through: weddings, private events, photography, beer, wine, and spirits, where you probably are getting tons of questions, culinary kind of things, and that's some of our value-added foods as well. And then the adventures and activities that we're used to or most define agritourism. So first is the wedding trend. A lot of folks do this not knowing what they're going to get into. In my home county, we've had like 3 or 4 pop up just in the past year. This is where most of you start getting your zoning questions from your local zoning authorities. But the pricing is a challenge. Folks don't know how to price this. They're not typical wedding venue kind of people. They don't know about planning services or what to add, so they're not looking at how to add on or make more, so they don't add the fries to the hamburger. Alcohol is a huge question on the liability side. Whether people can bring their own or must have a caterer, things like that aren't really thought up front. And then the opportunity for more income by renting items, and what are the liability options there. Second is private events and photography. So whether it's the photographer that wants to come use the farm for the day or wants to cross-promote with the farming operation, whether it's the young couple that wants to get engaged at the Christmas tree farm, or the friend of the mom-to-be that decides that, hey, a farm is a great place to have a baby shower. There's lots of things that they call and ask different agritourism farms to have. These are definitely out of season, and the biggest challenge I see here is they're not set up like they are for a fall season or for a spring greenhouse season, things like that. And are they really thinking about liability and safety and all these issues? Are they unsupervised events? Are there contracts with these different folks that need to be looked at? What are the rules of the farmstead? For example, if people are setting up for a private event or even a wedding, what's the liability there if they bring 5 little kids that decide they're going to go play and get in the pen with the goats? Those kind of challenges. Third, beer, wine, and spirits. So we're always on the cutting edge. Farmers are always looking, what's that next piece of revenue we can look at? So it's more value to those crops. It's tastings. It's all the other things like this Gold Rush cider. So Gold Rush is a resilient apple that can last all through the fall. It has a perfect, apples are all about sweet and tart. So it's the acid and the sweetness. And this apple tastes exactly like a sweet tart, and it lasts forever. So definitely something they've added to a brand, and they're able to make more money off that product. More and more apples are being grown for cider apples, for hard cider. Culinary things, whether it's on-site food at this urban farm, food safety is definitely an issue here. Dinners that a farm provides or just promotes, dinner for a charity event, or in the picture, Gold Rush cider. So not necessarily hard cider, but at one farm here in Ohio, White House Fruit Farm, they call this the champagne of ciders because it's almost perfectly clear and definitely has a unique taste to it. So all those things on food, do farms really think about the food safety aspects, the requirements of being a level 1 ServSafe certified person, getting that level 2 license as well. So it definitely interests the health department once they see this in the paper. And the fifth one is what a lot of you might are more used to when it comes to a lot of the agritourism farms, connecting people to the farm, getting them to unplug, do a corn maze. Those are definitely still relevant. I think 8 or 10 years ago, we started having the conversation, is a corn maze going to last forever? And I think it's become the pumpkin, the more experience like a pumpkin is to everybody has to have one that people just do in the fall. Making those nature connections, trying to work at games, even things like zombie paintball are some of the things happen in a lot of these farms. So it's definitely a challenge. And then the old-fashioned stuff like the kid getting to feed a baby calf. So E. coli becomes a challenge there that we'll talk about, or Peggy will talk about here in a little bit. So lots of things that farms can do to get people to come out and visit their operations. So as we, before we get into some liability and insurance kind of things, we wanted to share this about how farms can really think about developing a new activity. Where do they really begin? So this is how decisions are made. So I work with a lot of agritourism farms, and they go to a conference in their own state, which is going on right now in Ohio, or another state, or NAFMA, which is the North American Farmers Direct Marketing Association, and they see an activity and they think, wow, that looks fun. It seems to make a lot of money for that farm. And then they say, which got cut off a little bit, but I can build that. So can't you see these farmers that are used to building their own sheds and fixing all their own equipment saying they can build this giant slide that people can use on their farm without knowing the slope and angles and all those kind of things. So that's how they're making decisions. They're just looking a lot profitability for the most part. So in the, like Peggy said, on the website where the information about the webinar is, there's this whole decision tree. It talks about the top topics that we really need to pay attention to or help farmers pay attention to. It's as inclusive. We've been through this several times and tried to redo it, but that activity sheet is in there. So the topics really guide the discussion. It enhances the brand. It fits the target market. It talks about safety and insurance considerations, labor and expertise to cost and the cost of building or installing on the farm, the labor to actually operate the activity, and income or benefit to the farm. So, and we originally just had income, but a lot of times there's other benefits to what actually an activity brings. So sometimes it can be a free activity that just keeps people at the farm longer, which adds to other sales, but also could cause parking problems, things like that. So on the sheet, there's the example of the barrel train. Here's an example that the farm built. Does it look like it works? I think so. Is it safe? I don't know. That looks like the little rubber edges on all these metal barrels, or maybe they're plastic. They're trying to cover up what might cut a child. So it looks like something would need a lot of inspection as it gets used. We look at a thing like a pumpkin slingshot. We have two people trying to pull this thing back, trying to hit a target. Slingshots, when they're first put in, are probably one of the most dangerous things you can imagine, because that pocket, whatever's in there, whether it's an apple or a small pumpkin, if it's pulled at the wrong angle, it can flip back and shoot the person in the face. So we use that slingshot as our example. There's a chart like this on the sheet. So each farm can write down their activity. It's something you can give to clients as they decide, we're going to start adding this. And you can remind them about liability. Here, fill the sheet out. So the activity ID is that slingshot. It enhances my farm brand, yes, because it's active. Parents can do it with their kids. Grandparents can do it with grandkids. It fits my target market. It not only attracts the kids because it's fun, but the parents also think it's fun. Safety and insurance. So it definitely needs regular safety checks. Usually something like a slingshot, because of the amount of use it gets, you need to have a new one every year. You might think it looks okay, but those rubber pieces over time with ultraviolet light and use really break down quickly. The build is specific due to potential of turning the pocket. So it's something they want to know what's the manufacturer recommends for actually installing this, how far the pole should be apart, looking at that more and more. And we're seeing that in Ohio, certain things are being regulated by the Department of Agriculture because now they're saying, well, maybe this is a ride like it is at the county fair. So they really rely for all those things on the manufacturer's specifications. So something to look at. Then that labor expertise, looking at, well, we think about $500 per site. If we look at the poles to put in, whatever the cost of the actual slingshot itself, what we're going to actually put in it, things like that, about 500, and we might need several of those to do it. The labor is one person per 2 slingshots. So if we're looking at somebody above minimum wage, $9 or $10 an hour, plus all the benefits, FICA, about $13 an hour. So we can get a good idea of what to do then. Real quick, somebody asked, can we get a website where this is available? Yeah, it's on the National Ag Law Center. So it's nationalaglawcenter.org. So where the original information was for today's webinar, it's right on there. Then the income for the farm, they wrote down just a note. They did a budget. There's all kinds of crop budgets, and a lot of those online are in Excel spreadsheets, and they can be just adapted to an activity. Those are good places to start because it lists everything from fuel, oil, and grease to seeds and everything else. So those really help people get ideas of what they actually need to budget for income and expenses. So we think about $10,000 a season, and then we have to have the other section too. This is the family all really in agreement sometimes? Mom hates the idea. She's seen all these accidents on other farms. So really looking at what are those possibilities for each activity. There are other things like paintball on the right, a lot of farms adding that, and then zombie paintball. It might fit. It might bring in a lot of money. What are the liability concerns? We keep forgetting about that when we start. We look at the big dollars and don't go through the whole chart. Some other trends we're seeing in activities, this combine slide, definitely a fun thing, but more of a loss leader or part of a play area. And then an Easter egg hunt, and I thought these were kind of fun. More and more farms are doing this, but with sporadic weather, this becomes more of a challenge. That's why one of the farms went to an adult event, not in a bad way, but they win prizes like TVs and things like that, and they drink wine while they're doing it. So it's a lot of fun, but also some liability. And then the fabulous fad of goat yoga. I prefer not to have a goat urinate on me when I'm doing yoga, but it's a trend and people are loving it and it seems to continue to grow. But what are the issues there? All right, we'll move on to Peggy and talk about all this fun and the risk involved.
Right. Thank you, Eric. And that's an important question. What is the risk involved in some of these activities, and what kind of liability can it bring back to the operator who has offered that activity? And so when looking at Eric's chart and thinking through the safety and insurance considerations, this is where we can connect to that question of what's the liability risk. If there's a lot in that column and a lot of concerns about what would need to take place in order to try to make that activity safe, and is it insurable, now we're talking about a liability risk that should factor into the decision on whether or not to offer that activity on the farm. The way that we get to liability when we look at some of these activities is through a typical legal cause of action called negligence, and that can make that operator liable if there's a failure for that operator to meet the duty of care that the operator had for people who are on the farm. And if that failure causes injury somehow, then the operator can be liable for harm under negligence. And that's what I want to talk about, or what I want to focus on for this presentation. Liability is a big term, and there are a lot of different ways we can discuss liability, but for purposes of today's webinar, I really want to focus on when might an operator be liable for injury to a person who is on the farm and engaging in these kinds of agritourism activities that Eric just described. Another way that we could place liability on that operator is through the theory of product liability. And in times past we didn't have to worry about that as much, but because, as Eric said, there's a lot of trends toward new, different kinds of products as far as amusement activities like the slingshots or food products or wine or beverage. All of those are products that the operator is offering out there to those farm visitors. And so if there's a defective product that causes injury to one of those farm visitors, the operator is again subject to that possibility of liability. So two major areas that expose an operator to legal liability. And this is something that's real. We're seeing more and more cases as agritourism grows in popularity. We're seeing more cases of serious injuries that occur on some of these farms. And I've given you a couple of recent situations just last fall with the bounce pad on the farm that became disengaged, and the 2-year-old child was carried off in that bounce pad and ended up dying, and his sister was harmed as well. And then prior to that, there was a pretty serious accident in Maine in a haunted hayride incident. Both of those creating serious liability issues for those farms. So this is something that we have to take seriously. And you always know that that a certain topic is serious when you start seeing the attorneys jump on board, and we are. There are law firms now that are proclaiming to specialize in agritourism industry accidents. Those are popping up in several places around the country, and so reaching out for those who are suffering a personal injury as a result of being on an agritourism farm. So something to think about. This is now to the level where liability is a serious concern that we need to take seriously. So there are ways we can manage that risk of liability, and Eric's already talked a little bit about selection of your activities. That's certainly one way to assess whether that fun is worth the risk that it poses. We're going to talk, or Eric's going to talk in a bit about preparedness and how that can reduce liability risk. But I want to focus on the traditional tool of insurance. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and first talk about immunity laws that are also popping up around the country to address this issue of liability. We have a couple of new fact sheets that are available on the National Ag Law Center's site that we've mentioned several times. One covers immunity laws in the United States, and the other addresses insurance for agritourism activities. So you can find those on the website. When we look at immunity laws, seems to be a trend in popularity with these laws as we see more and more people engaging in agritourism activities. And what the laws do is provide some protection on that liability issue. And you can see here now that we have 31 states with agritourism immunity laws. Alaska just enacted one that became effective the first of this year. That's the newest law that we have in place. But in those states that aren't on that list, there are some other immunity laws that might come into play for the agritourism operator. We have recreational user laws, equine activity acts, and UPIC immunity laws that might provide some protection in terms of liability in those states that don't yet have the agritourism immunity law. I want to talk a little bit about what those laws look like, because they're very important in managing that liability risk. And you can find this compilation on the National Ag Law Center site under State Compilations, which is up at the top in the top banner there. You'll see State Compilations. If you go to that, you'll find the agritourism compilation listed, and that will bring you to this map of states. And then you can click on a state to determine if it has a law, and it will also then provide you with the specific law in that state. So as we look at these laws around the country, as I said, they generally protect an operator from legal liability, not for everything, but for injuries that result from certain agritourism activities and in certain places. And they're basically going to be based on this legal theory of assumption of risk that suggests that someone who can know or should know that an activity is risky and chooses to voluntarily proceed in the face of that risk, then that person assumes the responsibility for their safety, and then also assumes the risk that comes with that activity. That's the general theory behind many of these agritourism activity or agritourism immunity laws. And the other part of that, though, is that because it's a risky activity, there's not a lot that the operator can do to remove all risk. They might be able to manage and remove some risk, but you can't remove all risk. They're inherently risky activities, and so someone who chooses to proceed in the face of that, knowing that that's an inherently risky activity, then has the responsibility for their own safety. So the way that the law works is to clarify that in statutory form. So I want to go through some of the common elements that you may see in your state with your immunity law. And if you're in a state that doesn't have one, give some considerations for perhaps putting an agritourism immunity law into your code, getting some legislation going. Here's some of the common elements that we see. First, you have to clarify who and what is going to receive that immunity. And by immunity, I mean they are immune from legal liability because of this statute. So what types of operators and what types of activities does this law cover? And it's very common in these laws to see an initial definition of agritourism or agritourism activities or agritourism providers, and those will clarify who and what gets the immunity that the law is providing. If an operator or an activity doesn't fit into those definitions, then that operator or that particular activity won't receive the liability protection in the statute. Some of the common requirements that I see around the country is first that there's a requirement that this agritourism activity be taking place on a working farm or a commercial farm, or someone that is engaged in agricultural production. There seems to be a preference there in the statutes to give the protection to those who are actively engaged in farming and not just someone who is offering an agritourism activity on a residential property or a property that isn't engaged in agriculture. There's not a lot of consensus on whether the operator has to or doesn't have to be receiving compensation for that activity. Many of the statutes state what I've provided there, and that is the operator may or may not be compensated for that activity, and it can still qualify as an agritourism activity. And then the other common thread in these definitions of agritourism or agritourism activity is the purpose. What's the purpose of the activity? And most of the statutes state something like this, that it's, for educational, recreational, or entertainment purposes. Those are the three most common. And then a number of statutes also add historical or cultural purposes for the activity in order to clarify what types of activities fall under the statute. And there are a handful of states that list specific examples. Here's an example of one state. This is from Oklahoma, and I saw that we have someone from Oklahoma here. So this is what your statute in Oklahoma defines as an agritourism activity, and this is a good example. I think it's one that is fairly representative from around the country. So it's any activity carried out on a farm or ranch that allows members of the public for recreational, entertainment, or educational purposes to view or enjoy rural activities. And then it states some specific things like farming, ranching, historic, cultural, harvest your own, or natural activities and attractions. And then many of the states have that statement there that an activity is an agritourism activity, whether or not the participant paid to participate in that activity.
So thank you for joining us today for part 1 of Farms and Fun. Be sure to join us next time when we will hear more about trends in agritourism from Eric Barrett and more about managing liability risks associated with agritourism from Peggy Kirk Hall. In the meantime, if you'd like to do more investigation on your own, you can go to u.osu.edu/agritourism to learn about decision-making process for adding an activity to your farm. You can learn more about agricultural law in general by going to farmoffice.osu.edu. And we also want to thank the National Ag Law Center, who was the original producer of this video, and they have many resources available on their website as well. We look forward to seeing you for part 2 of Farms and Fun.